For those of you who didn't suffer the pain and agony of seeing me this morning, my name's Quentin and I'm associate editor of the Financial Times, but based in Berlin, which is a very interesting perspective to be looking at the world from these days. And I experienced the ride from Berlin last night down the road to Wroclaw, getting here just about midnight. But actually, it's wonderful to be here for the first time. It's nice to have an excuse to come. Anyway, we've got a very distinguished panel. We're running exactly a quarter of an hour late, so I'm told that I can go exactly 10 minutes over at the other end. So we'll try and get 5 minutes back, if I may. I barely need to introduce anybody. I certainly don't need to introduce Radosław Sikorski, who's going to start our debate here on democracy and prosperity. Carl Gershman, President of the National Endowment for Democracy, will follow up. And then it's wonderful to have somebody from Tunisia, Hédi Abbes, Secretary of State to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia, to give us a perspective from the Arab Spring. And finally, I'm going to come, last but not least, to Feinstein, the US Ambassador to Poland. But the subject of democracy and prosperity is a fascinating and a rather challenging one, I think. Because one, you can look at it clearly from both perspectives. Is democracy necessary in order to be rich? Or is it necessary to be quite rich in order to have democracy? Are the two essential to each other? Indeed, in this day and age, are the two compatible? Look at what's happening in the Eurozone, right next door, where in order to try and get our economies back on the road, we seem to be, in some cases, actually moving away from the obvious democratic solution, or the democratic solution, as in Greece, is producing a dead end, a nightmare. The whole thing might come to a shuddering halt if the Greek people, as is entirely their democratic right, vote to throw out the whole rescue plan for Greece. So there's a real problem there. But there's a long history of this debate of democracy and prosperity, and one in which I think, Radosław Sikorski, you've been very much involved and have very strong views on the subject. But has the world changed a bit since you first really became passionate about the need for democracy? Over to you.
Thank you, but does this work?
Most of them do, but one doesn't, I think.
The same as his mom. Oh, my luck.
Yeah. Take it away and we'll share what's left.
Raz.
Thanks.
They thought the foreign minister didn't need a microphone.
Before I get on to the subject of the panel, let me just comment very briefly the latest events in Polish-US relations, which have been exciting the nation. It reminded me of an unusually self-reflective comment by a member of the previous US administration, who, not entirely in jest, opined about what it's like to be an ally of the United States. To be an ally of the United States is like lying in the mud next to a big hippopotamus. At the beginning, it's great. You feel warm, you feel secure, you feel joint power. But then, inevitably, comes the moment when the hippopotamus turns on his back. And you're getting crushed, and the problem is the hippopotamus doesn't even know you're there. And and the thing is that we, Poland, are a little bit in that situation, but with a twist. We can't stop the hippopotamus from turning, but we are determined to make sure that he hears our screams when we are being crushed. And that's policy. On democracy and prosperity, as you say, Quentin, there's a huge literature about it. I can just say that the recent experience of Poland and the entire post-communist world certainly is an excellent argument in favor of a strong link. But I think Poland 25 years ago was not only a dictatorship, but was also very poor. And we were literally a bankrupt state. We were not honoring our international obligations, and there was hyperinflation, and people's living standards were extremely low. Today, we are closing the gap with Western Europe at the fastest pace in our history. Just in the last 4 years, we've moved from, I think it was 48 or 54% of the EU median to 68% of the EU median. And we've overcome Belgium, Sweden, and recently Holland in total GDP. So for us, it works. But I think if you go beyond us, you see the trajectory away from dictatorship and towards democracy being matched by corresponding success in building prosperity. Compare Central Europe with Central Asia, or even within this former Soviet Union, Baltic states with Central Asia, and you have your argument. There is an old anecdote about Leonid Brezhnev visiting Indira Gandhi, apparently true. Brezhnev was pretty senile by then, and when Indira Gandhi spoke about problems in the Punjab, Brezhnev woke up and said, Prime Minister, you have these constant problems in the Punjab. We in the Soviet Union don't have such problems. We haven't had them for 60 years. And I think the Indians now have the last laugh because the Soviet Union didn't have such problems until it collapsed. And in fact, it turned out that with all the problems, India has been a more stable state. And where I think the jury is still out is whether the less fast but steady development by India will, in the long run, be more stable than the extremely fast, but under a different model, growth of China. And I think we have to agree with Deng Xiaoping here, commenting on the French Revolution, to say that it's too early to judge. And let me just end by posing a thesis of why this is so. Because I think there is an assumption that some dictatorships may be better at some economic tasks because they don't have to pay attention to public opinion. So it was supposedly communist governments were supposed to be good at the early stages of industrialization, with their obsession of building up the industrial base, the heavy industries, the infrastructure. Well, guess what? In Poland, we are only now building our infrastructure. If only the Marxists had followed their own ideology and had built us a proper infrastructure. They didn't. And then look at what we've just done in Poland. The president of Poland today has announced that he would sign the pension reform. We are extending the pension age from 60 to 67. the sources of our pension disequilibria were the fact that under the Jaruzelski military dictatorship, extravagant pension privileges were granted. So authoritarians were profligate, Democrats are being quite tough. And my thesis is this, that contrary to received wisdom, dictatorships also have public opinion. And dictatorships are usually more cowardly than democrats. And that's why fundamental economic reform under dictatorships, such as in Chile, for example, is the exception, not the rule. That actually it's usually the Democrats who have to tidy up the mess, including economic mess, left by dictatorships. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I come straight back to you there? Angela Merkel talks about the tension at the moment between politics and the markets. And she says reconciling that tension between the slow-moving, painful democratic decision-making process and the fast-moving, sometimes hysterical, over-the-top financial markets is one of the great challenges we face today in the system. Now, we've seen that government after government has fallen across Europe recently because of the financial crisis. I mean, it is not the norm to be re-elected. In Poland, you managed to turn that round. But the norm is actually that democratic governments are getting hammered by the voters for a financial crisis over which fundamentally they have no control. How the hell do we reconcile that? Have you a nice answer for Frau Merkel? Or perhaps you, Radek, I'm asking you.
Well, I do think there is a... Hello?
Yeah.
Well, one democratic government is being replaced by another, so it's not a question of democracy. It's a question of governance, governability at the European level. And Europe is simply not governable financially at the European level right now. In the US, you have a treasury, you have a single Federal Reserve, and you've managed to manage the crisis. And in Europe, we need to create those institutions. And the problem is that what it takes to fix it takes a great deal of leadership and an application of power. And we have constructed institutions in the multilateral manner, which is to say, by denying those individuals the attributes of power and of ability to make things happen. And that's partly because too many European politicians for too long have bashed Europe, including in some countries that you know, and have denied Europe the instruments of leadership. And partly to do with the fact that the selection of personnel at the European level has not been democratic enough.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Karl Gershman. I want, in a way, to ask you the same question, though. I mean, it was very easy, wasn't it, at the end of the Cold War to say, of course democracy produces a more prosperous society. Of course democracy is the right answer, because the truth was that the communist creation that was the Soviet communist creation was a complete nightmare in terms of producing prosperity. But today we have these two things. We have the example of China, which is, after all, has dragged more people out of poverty than any other country in the history of man. And secondly, we have this challenge in the democratic world that we are not yet, and I would perhaps beg to differ with Radek about the US having overcome its economic crisis. I think that it might not feel like that to President Obama trying to get re-elected. We have a challenge on both sides. So actually, have you had to rewrite the script?
No, you just... Is this on? Okay. You don't have to rewrite the script, but you always have to be adjusting to new realities. It's not as if, you know, pre-1989, everything was terrific for democracy. Look at the 1970s. Look at the United States in the 1970s after, you know, the oil boycott and the problems of the Carter administration, talking about malaise. I mean, these were very severe problems. The early part of the Reagan administration, when there was, you know, recession, a lot of unemployment. It's not as if, you know, all of this is new. There are certain things that are new. I, by the way, don't, you know, I don't think the China model is all that it's cooked up to be, and more importantly, nor do the Chinese. I mean, you know, 60 to 80% of the wealthy in China, you know, want to leave, taking their money out. They're very, very nervous. You know, protests are going up there, you know, multiplying rapidly. There are over 200,000 collective protests every year right now. Less than 20 years ago, there were about, you know, less than 10,000 of those protests. It's becoming a, you know, they're trying to keep the lid on through repression, but I don't think that's a great model. So, you know, you have a lot of new problems today. I think, you know, the biggest new problem that Europe faces is the demographic problem. You know, it's very hard to meet your bills if you know, you have fewer and fewer workers and more pensioners. People are living longer and having fewer children. I mean, that's a very difficult problem. And nobody really has the solution to that, except that, you know, our assumptions about social protection, the welfare state, you know, have to be adjusted to that reality. They simply have to be adjusted. You know, Europe is not like America because it's not a single country. And, you know, you don't have a treasury the way we have a treasury. You don't have a president the way we have a president, and you can make decisions that cover the whole country. You can't do that in Europe. So, you know, I think, you know, those are, I mean, that to me is the biggest new problem that we have. I think, you know, democracy faces other problems. I'm an optimist. I mean, I'm fundamentally an optimist about democracy. I think, you know, in this country, it went through a very difficult post-1989 transition, you know, the removal of subsidies and all, you know, the other forms of, even though it didn't really work very well, it created, you know, there was 30% poverty, there was, you know, rises in inequality as markets took hold. And, you know, you did have democracy being able to cushion the blow by, you know, by channeling resources to the people who needed it. That's what democracies can do. And you know, I think Amartya Sen was correct when he said that democracy has an instrumental function. You know, its institutions protect people. They do help, you know, society meet its challenges. There are new studies that have been done about, you know, really confirming the ancient wisdom of Adam Smith about, you know, the rule of law, markets, you know, social peace. You can't have social peace really without democracy that, you know, that is inclusive of all the different people. But I think that in addition to this problem I spoke about in Europe, I mean, Europe is obviously facing new and very severe problems today. The economic crisis of 2008 has created a tremendous amount of social tension. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, you know, just issued a report, I think it was issued last December, saying that, you know, in a lot of countries in this region, support for democracy has gone down. 20% in Slovakia and in Hungary. There's a study done by the Legatum Institute, which, you know, talks about the rise of intolerance against minorities, against immigrants. Freedom House has done a report that talks about the contraction of press freedom in a lot of countries in the region. They note 3 in particular, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, that are no longer characterized as free when it comes to free press. They're partly free. And there are problems in a lot of countries. They point out, even in this country, there are problems regarding free media, and free media is necessary to deal with economic problems. So these are, really difficult challenges that democracy faces. And I really, I want to take the opportunity of speaking here just to identify another challenge, which is maybe a little bit more long-term, but it's one that a lot of the people who have thought most deeply about democracy have called attention to. I'm thinking in our own country of the Frenchman Alex de Tocqueville, who came to the United States back in the 1830s to take a look at our democracy. Czesław Miłosz, Václav Havel, Leszek Kolakowski have all pointed to the importance of religion to democracy as something that prepares citizens, makes them responsible people, prepares them to take on democratic responsibility. Miłosz was very, very worried about whether the values that we cherish, the liberal values we cherish, could survive if the foundation of those values, religion, just disappeared. And Kolakowski wrote very tellingly about that in his book, My Correct Views on Everything. I mean, this is something that also worried Tocqueville, the problem of greed. I mean, we all want economic development. We all want growth. But Kolakowski, wrote about, he said that during the last few decades, and he was writing in the 90s, I think, when he said this, or this was an interview, we had rapid economic growth, and we got used to the idea that all of us moderns could have everything, and indeed that we deserved everything. And then he said, religious tradition has taught us to limit ourselves, to place a distance between our needs and our wants. All the great religious traditions have taught us for centuries not to become solely bound up in one dimension, the accumulation of wealth and the exclusive preoccupations with our present material life. And then he concluded this by saying that it would be a cultural catastrophe if we lose the ability to maintain this distance between our wants and needs, and the survival of our religious heritage is the condition for the survival of civilization. And I think, throughout Europe and beyond, certainly in the advanced Western countries, that tradition is getting weaker and weaker, and that's going to increase the tension, I think, in dealing with these problems. Because people are simply not going to accept the fact that we might have problems, and there are larger things in life. I mean, that's a larger issue. I know it's not necessarily the central issue at a policy conference, but it's the underlying problem that we all face. And Havel, spoke about this all the time, the transcendental dimension, and how essential that was to democracy and maintaining the values that that we cherish.
It's a challenging thought. I mean, are you telling me that you can't be secular and democratic?
Depends on what you mean by secular, and I'm happy to have my Tunisian friend here, because there's a very interesting man in Tunisia by the name of Rachid Ghannouchi, who is the head of the Renaissance or Nahda party, which is now the leading party in Tunisia. And he has spoken about secularism recently, but in an American sense. It's interesting that this person who was put in prison, spent 2 decades in exile in London, and is now, the head of the leading party in Tunisia, and, called a fundamentalist, has embraced secularism, but an American concept of secularism. What does that mean? A separation of religion from the state, but a religious society. A religious society. And that's what Tocqueville wanted. A religious society that could shape the customs of the community, the habits of the heart, is what he said, to prepare citizens for responsibility and citizenship. If that declines, we're in deep trouble. And I admire Ghannouchi, and I think it's hopeful for the Arab Spring that he spoke in those terms and embraced a concept of secularism that does not reject religion.
Yeah, and that's a relief to hear that, because on the whole, examples we have where religion takes over the state tends to come out rather authoritarian.
Well, you have Iran in mind, but the Middle East is not Iran. What happened in the Middle East last year and what is happening now is not Iran 1979. And do not confuse them.
I will move on, therefore. Perfect introduction to our next speaker, because Hédi Ben Abbes, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to, for me at least, to report from the front line. I mean, I would be fascinated to hear how you feel that, what are the challenges ahead of you? You in Tunisia led the Arab Spring, you launched the Arab Spring. Without Tunisia, there wouldn't have been yet an Arab Spring. It's actually, in 3 countries, authoritarian regimes have been overthrown in effect, and yet the jury, as Radek said, the jury is still out as to which way you go. How are the challenges as you see them today?
Thank you. The question is really difficult to answer in a simple way. Let me first say that His Excellency said that dictatorship might have its own virtues. I'm just translating your words. It made me think about one of James Joyce's saying when he said that people are just like olives. Just press them and they will yield their oil, meaning that they will give the best of them. Having said this, if we have to choose between democracy and dictatorship, the choice is very simple to make. The question that is raised in Tunisia today is how to create democracy out of scratch, how to build up new institutions, how to make those institutions contribute to the general growth, be it economic, social, psychological even. We noticed that in Tunisia we have a big problem of psychology. People have been destroyed in their psyche during decades of dictatorship. So we have a number of different challenges that we have to face. And the equation is difficult because it is not a question of the relationship between democracy and prosperity. We all know that both of them feed on each other. We cannot have democracy without economic prosperity because we cannot feed people just slogans, ideas. We have to give substance to those ideas, and that substance would be and should be economic and social growth. But the equation, why is it difficult? Because we need to create all that at the same time. We need to create institutions, we need to implement democratic ideas and to give them a materialization in daily life, in political and economic institutions, while we have to meet a very, very high expectations from people. Because once again, they wish to harvest the fruit of their own revolution. So now in Tunisia, we are starting to build up those institutions. And it begins with the writing of a new constitution. We decided that we have to build from scratch. So we are engaged into the writing of a constitution. And the first question that was raised was about religion. What to do with religion? What is the status or the place of the religion in a modern society? And after a period of debate, we decided that we are going to implement a system by which religion could be respected, but it could not be the source or the basis for a government. So we opted for a system that is midway between what we call extreme secularism, roughly speaking, the French model, and of course, conservatism, let's say the Iranian way. And we said that religion should be respected. But when it comes to dealing with politics, when it comes to dealing with the management of the city, as Plato says, we need to keep religion at bay. That does not mean that religion does not count it counts because it is part of our identity. It is part of our even way of thinking. It is in the thread of people's mind. So we cannot get rid of it when we do not have to and we do not wish to. So this is why we are writing a constitution where, right in the preamble, we say that we respect religion. Religion is part of society, but we are going to manage the country from a secular point of view. The laws are going to be written from that perspective and not from necessarily a religious perspective. So this is very difficult probably to understand, where we are used to a very clear-cut division between secularism on the one hand or religious state. We have opted for a system that is quite midway between these two poles. And we do not really have trouble with that, because we have been living like that for years. But still, we need to redefine everything. We need to start by redefining even what is our own identity. Because dictatorship, one of its major damages is that it erased from people's mind the very definition of who they are. Because in a dictatorship, they used to think on behalf of the people, they used to decide on behalf of the people, and all of a sudden, after the revolution, we found ourselves facing a big issue. Who are we? How am I going to speak on my own behalf? How am I going to speak my own mind and my own ideas? What is my relationship to religion? What is my relationship to others? How to handle all those differences in society? So we are really engaged into a process of redefining everything in Tunisia. And this is why, from time to time, we have people trying extreme things, because they have to try all the possibilities at the same time. So we think that in a relatively short period of time, we will manage to strike a balance between all those extremes, because our situation at this specific geographical position, at the tip of Africa, at the heart of the Arab world, within 50 minutes from Italy. So this privileged position, geographical position, implies that we are always looking north and south, east and west at the same time. And this is what makes the Tunisian character very special, because we are used to diversity, and we think that we have to maintain that diversity. This is why we have probably less problems than other societies dealing with democratic ideas and implementing those democratic ideas on the ground.
Thank you very much. And it's a reassuring view, but I want to ask you this. How long have you got to deliver prosperity back to your people, to the ordinary voters of Tunisia, before they actually say, to hell, this was a useless experiment?
This is not only a Tunisian challenge, but I think that it is a global challenge. Because if democracy succeeds in Tunisia, it will have major repercussions on the whole region and even beyond. So I think that we all have to contribute to make it succeed. The government is engaged into major reforms from the economic point of view. We are transforming the investment code, for example. We are opening up the country for foreign investments. We are creating a very favorable business environment, because the country is basically liberal from its, not in the English meaning of the word, but liberal in the French meaning of the word. That is to say, we are open to foreign investment. Let me give you good news, for the Americans at least. We decided last week to make franchise more open in Tunisia, the agribusiness, for example. So we are going to welcome McDonald's and Pizza Hut and so on. So this is probably one of the signs that the country is opening its doors for foreign investment. we think that all those efforts in terms of transparency, good governance, openness in every area will certainly incite people to come and settle and invest in Tunisia. And the perspectives are roughly speaking, very positive. And we think that in a couple of years, we are going to make that equation between democracy and prosperity something tangible and relevant in Tunisia. We are really optimistic. I'm just like you. I'm very optimistic about that.
Okay, great. Lee Feinstein, I'm coming to you. I don't want to tease out Radek's little image at the beginning of his talk too far, although to be the hippopotamus's messenger must be occasionally a little bit uncomfortable. I'm reminded of the fact that it isn't when the hippopotamus turns over that it's most dangerous to be in its vicinity. It's when it starts to mark its territory. But that, if I remember rightly, is an altogether more unpleasant experience. We'll move on from that quickly. I'd be very interested at your perspective. You've come here to Europe as a very experienced think tanker, experienced before. You're the US ambassador here in Poland. And I think that the Europeans are having a bit of a struggle with democracy after those early, heady years after the end of the Cold War. How do you see it?
Well, is this working? Yes? Well, I promise no rejoinders to the hippopotamus metaphor. Sure, not just Europeans, of course, but all of us are having difficulty coping with the economic challenges we're facing and the potential threats to our democratic principles and structures. You know, from an American perspective, from the very beginning, our view has been that democracy and prosperity are inextricably tied, and that these things can't be separated.
Pretty simplistic, isn't it?
Well, it begins. It's actually quite a sophisticated notion that, you know, somehow goes back to the theory, to the period of contract theory and the Enlightenment, and maybe even the Declaration of Independence, and the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was maybe a euphemistic way to say pursuing opportunity. So I think that for the United States, for Americans, these three things, the right to live, the right to be free, and the right to opportunity are all part of the social contract. And you see that really continuing throughout American history. You see it, for example, in Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, number 3 of which was freedom from want. And you see it as well continuing even through our civil rights movement, where human dignity was defined not just principally in the right to vote and the right to be heard, but even by people like Martin Luther King and in the women's movement as well, the right to human dignity, the right to earn a living. I guess what I would say is that, and of course you mentioned Europe, the Marshall Plan is you know, the example par excellence after the war of exactly this principle, which is that...
particularly democratic, the Marshall Plan. It was a brilliant idea, but it wasn't a reflection of democracy, was it?
I think the idea, frankly, was that...
General Marshall was a soldier. He wasn't an elected Democrat.
I think the idea clearly was that if... You're giving me a hard time. I think the idea is that democracy needs to deliver for its people if it's going to succeed and if it's going to resist some vulnerabilities to populist and other kinds of appeals. That's what I think is really the essence of the Marshall Plan, however implemented.
We need a Marshall Plan for Greece?
That is a question for my European friends. But what I would say is, and what I think the hippopotamus, and I'll leave it to Radek to decide what animal Poland represents, agree on, is that it's very, very important in terms of our foreign policy now, and we recognize this. This is no longer a debate. It's not a boutique item, but really central to how we think about the foreign policy challenges we face, that we need to promote free enterprise in those places we hope to seek in transition. And that's in North Africa and the Middle East, and both of our countries are working hard, and I hope successfully, and our Tunisian friend can tell us the degree to which that's true, on such programs. And, you know, not the least of which is in Afghanistan, which is a fight that can't be won principally militarily, but really through helping to stimulate, creating enough stability, but then creating the ability, the infrastructure, the basic institutions, so that Afghans can begin to generate a more or less self-sustaining economy, because that's clearly the only way, the best way to make the transition there and in other places that we're all seeking.
Okay, thanks very much, and I'm sorry to give you a hard time. I just felt we needed to stir up the debate a bit. You
it's
happen to be the guy who was speaking. I want to throw this open to the audience, and could I ask for the lights to be put up a little bit? So those who are sound asleep, wake up now, because I'm going to be able to see you. I can see somebody waving from the back, but I still want the lights up, because in fact, I can see several hands. And that'll be good. I would like, in the course, we've got just about half an hour for a debate here. I do think it's the most exciting example of maybe democracy really coming back today is the example we've been hearing about from the Arab Spring. But I do think that we are facing real challenges to our democratic process here. There is a sense of transition in Europe, certainly, and maybe in America too, where the center ground of democracy, these great old center parties that we set up on which we built our democratic system, are getting squeezed. And more we're seeing the growth of minority interest groups and campaigners. The internet's opening this up in an extraordinary way, and I'm not sure that our democratic system is able to come to terms with that. Now, the person who's very successfully waving a large piece of paper at me there gets my first, the eye first. Can you identify yourselves when you speak?
My name is Walter, and I have to testify what is about United States of America. And I can tell you that I emigrated to United States of America, and I'm speaking to you that why United States of America is the most successful country in the world. And it's going to be because the freedom, free enterprise is the best anywhere in the world. Because I came to America to zero. I mean zero, nothing. No one can help me except by myself. However, they gave me the opportunity in United States. And it's the best country anywhere. I just travel all over the world right now. So I will absolutely agree with the ambassador. Free enterprise and free entrepreneurship and freedom to all is the best. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That wasn't a question. I wonder, there may be some people out in the world that think that actually the most wonderful model in the world is actually the Chinese model. If there's anybody here who'd like to take that view, come on. But here in the front row. You got a mic? Yeah.
I have two questions. One to the State Secretary. We are in Poland, which is one of the most successful countries in democratization. So my question is to you, how much Tunisia thinks that it can take benefit of the experiences of Central Europe and the Baltics, not only in democratization, but the dual challenge of democratization and economic reform. So that would be my first question. My second question is really to all the panelists, but perhaps particularly to Minister Sikorski. There is this theory that after, because we really explored one side of the linkage between democracy and wealth, but the other side that the moderator referred to, that after a certain level of economic development, I mean, it can be very conducive to democracy. How do you think about Russia's democratic perspectives? Really, Russia has been growing reasonably well in the last decade, and we experienced the democratic movements on the streets in large Russian cities lately. So what do you think is the chance of middle class and welfare generation in Russia creating democratic momentum?
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, can I put even a slightly fine spin on that question on Russia and say, isn't the question, why hasn't Russia adopted a model of democracy that we would recognize as slightly more democratic? What is it about Russia? Is it actually the curse of a resource-rich society, the Paul Collier argument that says, if you are an oil producer or whatever else, democracy doesn't fit? But we'll come back to that. We have a question over here, yeah?
Thank you. Thank you. Daniel Bilak from Kiev. I'm a lawyer in Kiev, and I was a senior governance advisor to the Ukrainian government for 10 years. And my question is to Mr. Ben Abbes and to Minister Sikorski about the extent to which the legitimacy of institutions actually helps create the basis for democracy and prosperity. I invite Mr. Ben Abbes to study Ukraine's development since independence. It's a fantastic case study for you because we had to create institutions from ground zero and we've failed miserably. And if you don't have institutions that reflect the values of the people that are going to be the beneficiaries of those institutions, you will never create democracy and you will never create the prosperity that's necessary for that. And you can, in a contrary, I would be interested in hearing from Minister Sikorski about the extent to which the legitimacy of those institutions reflected the values in Poland that made it such a success. Thank you.
And which institution matters most?
Judiciary.
Yeah.
Independent judiciary, hands down. And
The
we're
rule
not
of
talking
law.
about, we're not talking about rule of law, just protection of property rights. The institutions, in my humble view, have to reflect the values in society, and fundamental among those values is the value of rule of law as a set of overarching principles of justice and fairness. And the way those institutions operate, especially your government institutions, they have to reflect those values in their everyday work. That's the essence of administrative justice, in which I had the benefit of helping Bulgaria and Lithuania with at one point as well.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to take one more. The gentleman with a very tired arm in the middle there with a small piece of paper in his hand. Keep that small piece of paper waving and then she'll see where you are.
Mateusz Mazzini, College of Eastern Europe. Given the fact that we are in times of crisis, I'll take the austerity measures and ask one question to two of our speakers today, Minister Sikorski and the Ambassador Feinstein. Gentlemen, if I may, I would like you to answer a question regarding what is democracy today, because I believe that we all agree that most of the youngest democracies we all know today, those who are considered to belong to the so-called third wave of democracy in famous Samuel Huntington's classification, were based on one unquestionable principle of the end of history, what Francis Fukuyama already more than 20 years ago announced, and were based on the unquestionable belief that there was one and only way of developing such a liberal democracy based on certain principles. But after more than 20 years, I think we all know it's not necessarily the case, and we were at least a bit wrong. And my question, maybe a bit provocative, is, would you agree with the thesis that before exporting the project of democracy to the Middle East or Northern Arab countries, we first have to rethink or maybe reform what we consider democracy and later spread the idea later on to newcomers to the world of democracy? Thank you very much.
Okay, good question. Hédi Ben Abbes, I'm going to come to you first because there were several points coming directly to you. You take whichever you want.
Right. Oh, actually, the two questions look alike. The one is about the model, the Polish model. And I remember immediately after the revolution that took place on the 14th of January in Tunisia, in February, we welcomed Mr. Lech Walesa in Tunisia. And he came to give us an account of the Polish experience. And you know that when a revolution starts, it takes everybody by surprise. And when it started in Tunisia, immediately after the dictator flew away, we asked ourselves, which direction are we going to take? Which model are we going to explore? And we immediately thought about Eastern Europe because it is the most immediate example. And of course, we thought about Poland as one of the models that may fit most to the Tunisian one because of different reasons. One of them is the importance of religion, the Christian religion in the Polish system. And we were really happy receiving Mr. Lech Walesa, President Walesa, to bring us his understanding of how to handle such a situation on a practical level, because he went through that same experience, but also how to create a balance between all these institutions. The religious institution, though it is not organized as such in Tunisia, religions did not take part in the uprise, but still, it is one of the major components of our society. So he came with a number of different good advices, which we are really taken seriously. I'm not going to explain that explicitly because the opposition will use them against us. But still, he really provided us with a number of different recommendations that we are taken very seriously. And one of the recommendations is about how to handle those who were in power, how to deal with them, because one of the questions raised is, shall we remove them? And if we remove them, can the state survive? The balance within the state could be maintained. So he really provided us with a number of different key ideas that we are really implementing today in Tunisia. And this leads me to speak about the institutions you mentioned. In Tunisia, we actually have institutions, and we had institutions. Even during the dictatorship, we used to have institutions. The only difference is that they were corrupt, fundamentally corrupt. And they were emptied of their own substance to be devoted only for the regime and for the benefit of the regime. So the challenge is how to keep those institutions because they survived the system. Let me give you an example. We didn't have 1 minute of electric shortage during the revolution. It means that the administration kept on working on a relatively fair basis. But still, corruption is everywhere, and we need to empty those institutions from those bad ingredients and inject new good governance in it. And that will take certainly a lot of time, because it is not a matter of laws you implement. It is a matter of how to make people change their way of thinking, because democracy, in our understanding, is very simple. It begins with the building up of the institutions, then rises to become a culture, and finally it becomes a practice, a daily practice. And we are still on the first stage of that evolution. We are building again afresh those institutions, but we endeavor to build them on good basis. For us, open government is one of the cornerstones of that, and we are engaged into it. And we think that if we build institutions from that perspective, we have a good chance to make democracy succeed in Tunisia, and therefore, probably, in some other countries, neighboring countries too.
Thanks very much. Karl Gershman, would you like to pick up on the point from Ukraine about institution building? Can I just put it... Okay, sorry, you want to come to...
No, I mean, there were a number of questions raised, especially the last one about the third wave, which let me start from there, if I may, because it's global and it encompasses everything. I mean, I really have no idea what you mean by we have to reformulate democracy. Certainly the people that we work with all around the world are not interested in, reformulating democracy. If you think about what's happened, the third wave is the Huntington thesis. The first wave was the US, the second wave was after World War II. The third wave started in Spain and Portugal in 74, 75, and then spread to Asia, Latin America, Africa, and then here in Central Europe. That's the idea of it. And if you think about what's happened since then, Huntington said that waves are succeeded by reverse waves. In other words, just as the first wave was succeeded by communism and fascism, that was the reverse wave, and the second wave was by the collapse of democracy. Well, it's interesting, there has not been a reverse wave. There's been a democratic recession with Putin and everything else, but there has not been a reverse wave. But what has happened, since the end of the third wave in the early 90s, you have Nigeria becoming democratic, Indonesia becoming democratic, Ukraine has tried, but it's a very, very difficult transition. And then you have this remarkable experience of the Arab Spring. The Economist magazine ran an article 2 weeks before Mohammed Bouazizi immolated himself on why democracy can't come to the Middle East. And they had a million arguments, the resource curse, they had strategic things, the fear of Islamism, Israel, culture, all of that. And then 2 weeks later, this started. The Arab world was the holdout. There was even a theory that the political scientists had called Arab exceptionalism, why they were different. And, they're not different. And what they want, even though they're going to find it in their own way, is they want what everybody wanted in 1989. There's no change in that. China is another example. Read Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Laureate. There's nothing that he wants that is not grounded in our concept of democracy. The Democrats in China are sort of seen as the advocates of universal values. The anti-Democrats are advocates of the China model. Okay, that's great. But, the people who they don't want a different version of democracy. Then we come, to the problem of Russia. And what's happening in Russia. Yes, there is a resource curse. I view the people in the streets in Russia as Russia's last hope. Russia is a dying country. It's losing population. Everyone wants to leave. I mean, the figures on who wants to get out of there are dramatic. There's a little bit of bravado with Putin. They represent the last hope. Can Russia finally overcome not just the resource curse, but its history? Because otherwise, Russia is going to continue. I don't want to see this happen. Russia is going to continue in decline because it's dying. We don't want to see that happen. And the hope for Russia is what these people in the streets want, which is what we think of as democracy, not a reformulated version of democracy, but where people can have contracts, property rights, political rights, independent media, all the things that we want, which are necessary for everything that they want. And maybe one last point about, Radek had sort of interestingly said that in response to something that you said, Quentin, that, they're not getting rid of democracy in Europe. It's democratic government being succeeded by democratic government. Dictatorships have a legitimacy which is called performance legitimacy. They have to perform in order to have legitimacy because they don't have political legitimacy. Democracy, with all its problems, has a deeper legitimacy. It rules by consent. And therefore, you can make mistakes, you can have problems. Democracy has the capacity to change and to reform itself. And that, I think, is going to be the great hope. Yeah, we're going through a tough time, but democracy can find a way to deal with the very, very difficult challenges that we have.
Okay, thanks. Radek.
I agree that the legitimacy of democracy has deeper roots, but I also believe that the world has become very specialized, and that most people don't want to participate in governing the country. They want us to do it reasonably well. And I would put to you another counterintuitive thesis, namely that the amount of legitimacy is not proportionate to the amount of democracy. Democracy is more legitimate when it also provides performance, when it works. Most people want to be left alone and want the right to kick us out occasionally and to replace us with the other lot. And democracies die not only by being taken over by dictatorship. I see problems of atrophy, of institutions not providing the public goods. We had this in Poland in the 18th century. It was a very democratic country by the standards of the time. 10% of the population was enfranchised, which was very high by European standards. And it was even so democratic that one deputy could not just veto legislation, but veto the legislation of the entire session of parliament. So a sort of filibuster gone mad. Very democratic and very inefficient, and it didn't work in the end. And we have some of those elements in Europe, and dare I say, also elsewhere. Democracy needs to provide the goods. And another way in which democracy, and I think the simplest way to undermine democracy, is to have pervasive corruption. And this is my answer to our Ukrainian friend. Last time I was in Kiev, I saw more fancy limos in front of the Verkhovna Rada than I see in all of Warsaw. And you can deal with it. We were perceived to be a corrupt political class in the 1990s. And there are very specific ways to deal with it. You have to have statements of assets, you have to have register of interests, and then you have to prosecute and to shame and to sack people who misstate their assets or break the rules. But leadership has to come from the top. But when it does, you can clean up the political class within 3 to 5 years. And I believe that in Poland, we have, in terms of personal financial honesty of politicians, one of the cleanest situations in Europe. Thank you.
Okay. Lee Feinstein, I've just been told we've got to finish in 5 minutes flat. Would you like to come back in on any of those points? There's one point which hasn't come up, which I would love to hear your opinion on, which is whether democracy is by definition national. Because in Europe, we are trying to do something a bit different, which is going to require a legitimacy at a supranational level. And the challenge is, can we do it? As a very wise observer here in Europe, do you think Europe can?
Well, let me go back to one of the questions that wasn't addressed, which was essentially the question of internal reform in existing democracies versus the notion of democracy promotion and the tension between those two things. And I guess on the first point, I would simply say, I keep quoting 18th century documents. But the preamble to the US Constitution says to create a more perfect union. And so, of course, as Radek was saying, I think all of our democracies are confronting now lots of problems in the mechanics of their democratic systems, in their ability to produce results when they need to produce results, and in the ability somehow, we've been talking about Tocqueville, so I'll move 1 century forward, somehow to rise above factionalism and to somehow discern and distill from all of that something that represents the national interest. That's becoming increasingly difficult for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with technological changes, some of which have to do with demographic changes, some of which have to do with older forms of government, in the case of the United States, somehow trying to be adapted to contemporary circumstances. But this is genuinely a problem, and one that requires very serious attention. And I think, speaking as honestly as an ambassador is allowed to speak, I don't think anybody can be sanguine about the ability to deal with these issues. One has to take them extremely seriously, this point of renewal. But this is quite a separate question from whether, notwithstanding the problems that we all have within our own systems, about what we do and the degree to which we want to assist or compare notes with other governments. And I think one of the things all of the countries that have made transitions from old systems to new systems have discovered is that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do it alone. And I'm thinking very much of the example of Radek in Libya. If I remember correctly, you were there twice. Right after the bombing and right after Gaddafi was killed. And I think your point was very simply, if I can remember the quote, if we did it, so can you. This is really important. It's very, very important for other countries to be able to look at different models. And I defer to my colleague from Tunisia, but my sense is, and this is in talking to Radek and other Polish leaders who've traveled to Central Europe, and some of Carl's colleagues as well at NDI and IRI, actually the knowledge in that part of the world about what happened here is quite limited, or was quite limited at the time, and it is very, very important to bring these countries, or at least offer the opportunity for these countries to be brought into a broader circle of democratic ideals and support. This, I think, is really essential. So whatever our problems are domestically, and we need to sort them out, that is a completely separate issue from trying to do what we can to support others who want better lives for themselves in their own countries.
I'm going to give the last word to Radek.
Just a quick comeback. Thank you, Lee, for those words. And it's exactly with this in mind that we worked closely with Al Jazeera, which produced a series of documentaries about the Polish experience in Arabic for the Arab world. And it's exactly with this idea in mind that Poland has advocated the creation of the European Endowment for Democracy, unashamedly modeled on the US original, for Europe to have an instrument of spreading democracy in the first instance in its immediate neighborhood.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your contribution. I'm sorry I didn't come back to the audience for more questions.